The fiancé sold my house secretly, so I made sure he lost everything. Eliza Parker had always believed she was in control of her life. A successful lawyer specializing in high-value properties, she had built her career with determination and intelligence. When she met Daniel Mercer, a charismatic and seemingly upright financial consultant, she felt that she had finally found someone who matched her. Their relationship was intense from the start, marked by romantic dinners, unforgettable trips, and a connection that seemed unbreakable. In no time, Daniel proposed, and Eliza, convinced she had found the perfect partner, said yes without hesitation. For months, Eliza's life seemed like a fairy tale. The wedding was being planned with attention to every detail, and Daniel made sure to involve her in every decision, from the venue to the honeymoon plans. But gradually, small signs began to bother her. Daniel always avoided discussing his finances in depth, claiming that his profession required secrecy. Moreover, he showed an increasing interest in Eliza's assets, asking questions about her properties and the legal processes involving her clients. At first, Eliza dismissed any suspicions, attributing these behaviors to the natural enthusiasm of building a future together. But something inside her began to awaken. It was an unsettling feeling, a premonition that something was not right. One night, while reviewing her bank notifications, she found a transaction she did not recognize. It was a small amount, almost insignificant, but it had been made from an account she had never authorized. Her heart raced, and a doubt began to form in her mind. Why would Daniel have access to any transaction in her name? The next day, she tried to rationalize what she had seen. Maybe it was a bank error, a simple mistake. But when she decided to look more closely at her financial records, she found other small, suspicious transactions, all recent. What worried her most was not the amount, but the strategy behind them. As an experienced lawyer, she knew that these movements could be tests for something bigger. When she told Daniel, his reaction was instant and calculated. He laughed, said it was absurd, and that if he wanted something from her, he would simply ask. But the seed of doubt had already been planted. The intuition that had guided her professional decisions so many times now warned her. Something was wrong. And as much as she loved Daniel and wanted to believe in his innocence, she could not ignore the signs. Eliza knew that to uncover the truth, she would have to act cautiously. The dream engagement was beginning to transform into a dangerous enigma. Eliza tried to continue her routine as usual, but the unease gave her no respite. The days passed, and her mind repeatedly returned to the suspicious bank transactions and Daniel's evasive responses. The man who had always seemed secure and transparent now appeared to her as a puzzle. Her instinct told her there was something much larger behind those transactions, yet doubt gnawed at her. Was she overreacting? Was she letting anxiety cloud her judgment? Determined not to act precipitously, Eliza opted for a discreet first step. She reached out to a trusted friend, Michael Chen, a cybersecurity expert, and asked him to analyze her bank accounts and any suspicious digital activity. Michael asked no questions. He simply assured her that he would investigate and keep her informed. Meanwhile, Eliza observed Daniel more closely. She began to notice patterns. Calls he avoided answering when she was near. Messages he quickly deleted. Small changes in behavior that had previously gone unnoticed. The tension grew within her, but Eliza knew she couldn't confront him without concrete evidence. So, she decided to test Daniel in a subtle way. During a dinner, she casually mentioned a property she had inherited from her grandmother, about which she rarely spoke. She watched his reaction carefully. To her surprise, Daniel displayed an exaggerated interest, asking detailed questions about the location and value of the property. It sent a shiver down her spine. Something was being planned, and she needed to find out what it was before it was too late. A few days later, Michael returned with a report that confirmed her suspicions. Small transactions had been made in her account, possibly tests for larger transfers. In addition, he discovered that there had been a remote access to her files from an unknown device. It was a clear indication that someone was trying to infiltrate her finances. When Michael asked if she wanted to involve the authorities, Eliza hesitated. She still wasn't absolutely sure that Daniel was responsible. But now there was a new element in the equation. If it wasn't Daniel, who else would have so much interest in her assets? And if he was involved, how far could he go? More than ever, Eliza felt that she was walking on a minefield. She couldn't fully trust anyone, but she also couldn't allow her fear to paralyze her. It was time to prepare for what was coming next. That night, Eliza had trouble sleeping. Her heart pounded, and her mind worked incessantly, replaying every detail of the past few days. The evidence was piling up, but the truth still eluded her. She needed something concrete before taking any action. Then, without warning, life struck her first blow. An unexpected notification on her cell phone made her sit up in bed, gripped by a chill down her spine. The alert came from the security system of her childhood home, a historic property she had inherited from her grandmother and kept under remote surveillance. A suspicious movement had been detected at the main entrance. With trembling hands, she accessed the live images and saw something that made her blood run cold. An unknown couple was leaving the house, accompanied by Vanessa Reynolds, a real estate agent she vaguely recognized. It was as if her property were being shown to potential buyers, but that was impossible. That house had never been for sale. Eliza felt a knot form in her stomach. She immediately called Michael and, without wasting any time, grabbed her car and drove to the neighborhood where the house was located. She parked a few meters away and began watching. Her mind tried to find a logical explanation, but there was only one possibility. Someone was trying to sell her property without her authorization. When she checked her documents, she found something even worse. A request for a transfer of ownership that had been recorded the day before. But how? Her name was still on the deed. Fear gave way to anger. Who was behind this? How could someone dare tamper with something that was rightfully hers? But before acting, she needed to be sure. She took a deep breath, snapped a few photos of the agent and the unknown couple, and returned to her car. On the way back, she felt her hands sweating on the steering wheel. She knew that this type of fraud existed, but she had never imagined that she would be a victim of one. That night, sitting alone in her apartment, staring at the evidence on her cell phone, Eliza realized that her life was about to change. The blow wasn't just financial, it was personal. That house represented her history, her family, her identity, and someone was trying to tear it from her hands. Whoever it was, they had no idea who they were dealing with. The next day, Eliza woke up feeling as if she weren't living her own life. Everything seemed surreal, as if she were trapped in a nightmare from which she couldn't wake. The illegal sale of her childhood home was a real threat, and she needed to act before the worst happened. She took a sip of bitter coffee, trying to organize her thoughts. She knew that someone had falsified documents to transfer the property, but the most disturbing question still hung in the air. Who was behind it? Michael called early, and the news he brought was the final blow to any hope that it was merely a mistake. Daniel's bank records revealed financial transactions linked to offshore accounts, and most shockingly, the signature on the supposed transfer of ownership was identical to Eliza's, a near-perfect forgery. Her fiancé not only had access to her documents, he had used her identity to steal what was rightfully hers. The man she planned to marry was behind it all. The ground seemed to vanish beneath her feet. For a moment, Eliza felt breathless, as if she had been punched in the stomach. The person she had trusted for 3 years, who slept beside her every night, had been scheming against her all along. Every gift, every gesture of affection, every sweet word now seemed part of an elaborate game of manipulation. Her heart ached, but her mind quickly took control. It wasn't time to cry. It was time to act. She took a deep breath and decided she wouldn't confront Daniel just yet. If he had been clever enough to plan such a well-structured scam, she needed to be even smarter to dismantle it. She called Judge Eleanor Montgomery, her mentor and godmother, and explained the entire situation. Within minutes, Eleanor was taking measures to freeze any transactions made in Eliza's name and launch an investigation into the forged records. Meanwhile, Eliza prepared to face Daniel as if nothing had happened. She had to keep playing the part of the passionate fiancé, maintaining her routine as if oblivious to everything. The thought of sleeping beside him that night, aware of his betrayal, was suffocating, but she couldn't afford to show it. Deep down, she knew that this game was just beginning, and the only way to win was to wait for the right moment to strike. While pretending normalcy beside Daniel, Eliza delved deeper into the investigation. During the day, she worked on her cases as if nothing were amiss. At night, she reviewed documents, tracked transactions, and pieced together the puzzle that would reveal the true nature of the man who once promised to love her. What she discovered was even worse than she had imagined. Michael, ever efficient, brought information that left Eliza breathless. Daniel had done this before, twice. Rebecca Chambers, a successful architect from Chicago, lost everything after a relationship with him. Her properties were sold, her bank account emptied, and without concrete evidence against him, she ended up drowning in debt. Ellen Whitaker, a lawyer in Boston, suffered a similar fate. Her career was destroyed after a fraud that Daniel orchestrated, which led to an unjust investigation. Both women disappeared from the radar, starting over from scratch. Every revealed detail increased the weight of betrayal. The pattern was clear. Daniel chose financially successful women, gained their trust, and gradually took everything that belonged to them. But now, he had made a mistake. He hadn't chosen just one more victim. He had chosen someone who knew how real estate fraud schemes worked, who understood the law and had powerful connections. The anger burned in Eliza's chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. Confronting Daniel at that moment would be futile. He would lie, try to manipulate her, pretend to be the victim. He was a calculating predator, and she would not give him the chance to escape. She decided that she would gather all the evidence before taking him down. He would not only lose what he had stolen, he would lose everything. That night, when Daniel lay beside her and wrapped his arms around her, Eliza closed her eyes and pretended to be that loving, naive woman he thought he had deceived. But inside, there was no longer any love. There was only the determination to end him before he ended her. Eliza knew time was against her. Daniel was careful, meticulous, and above all dangerous. He had deceived women before, emerging unscathed from every scam, and he wouldn't hesitate to do the same with her if he sensed he was being investigated. So, she played his game. She maintained the smiles, the romantic dinners, the conversations about the honeymoon. Every morning, she woke up next to the man who planned to destroy her, and every night, she gathered more evidence to ensure that he would be the one who eventually faced destruction. Yet behind that impeccable performance, Eliza felt the weight of tension growing. Every glance from Daniel seemed loaded with a subtext she couldn't decipher. He began to show an exaggerated interest in her schedule, asking questions that once seemed innocent but now sounded like attempts at control. "Will you be at the office all day?" Or, "Who are you having lunch with today?" were common phrases that before she would not have noticed. Now, she understood they were ways of monitoring her. At the same time, Daniel became increasingly affectionate, as if to reinforce her trust. He sent unexpected flowers, prepared special dinners, and even suggested that they set a wedding date as soon as possible. To anyone else, it would be a sweet gesture. To Eliza, it was a desperate move. He was speeding up the plans because he knew his time was running out. Inside, she wondered what he already suspected. Had he noticed something? Had she let slip a clue? Or was it just paranoia? Michael reassured her that nothing indicated Daniel knew he was being investigated. But Eliza felt that somehow he sensed something was different. The tension between them grew, yet neither spoke about it. It was like a chess game, where one wrong move could ruin everything. Then, one night, Daniel let slip a phrase that made Eliza's heart stop. "I was thinking, maybe we should take a trip before the wedding. Just the two of us. No distractions." The meaning was clear. He wanted to remove her from everything, to take her somewhere she wouldn't have access to her connections, her documents, her plan. A red alert sounded in her mind. The question now was not only what Daniel was planning, but how far he would go to ensure his scam was successful. Eliza knew she could no longer delay. Each day that passed, Daniel tightened the noose around her, trying to hasten the wedding and distance her from her connections. The sudden request for a trip was confirmation that he was ready to act, and she needed to be one step ahead. With caution, she decided to involve someone who could help her act discreetly and quickly. She called the one person she trusted completely, Judge Eleanor Montgomery. The meeting took place in the judge's private office, away from prying eyes. Eliza presented everything she had uncovered: the forged documents, the suspicious transactions, the connections to previous frauds. Eleanor listened to every detail in silence, her sharp gaze absorbing the complexity of the case. When Eliza finished, The judge took a deep breath and spoke firmly. "He is more dangerous than you imagine. If he has done this before and gotten away with it, he won't hesitate to go further to ensure he remains untouchable." Those words sent a chill down Eliza's spine. Until then, she had thought of Daniel as a cold manipulator. But what if he was more than that? And if, realizing he was cornered, he decided to cross an even darker line? Eleanor emphasized the gravity of the situation and took immediate measures. Using her influence, she secured a warrant to block any real estate transaction made in Eliza's name without her presence. Moreover, she instructed a forensic expert to analyze the forged documents, ensuring that the forgery could be legally proven. Meanwhile, Michael intensified the digital investigation. He tracked calls, messages, and even Daniel's location over the past few months. The most disturbing discovery came that very night. Daniel was not only trying to steal Eliza's assets, he was also monitoring her most valuable clients. His next targets were already mapped out, and the scams were in progress. He needed to be stopped before more lives were destroyed. Eliza left the meeting with Eleanor feeling both strengthened and more aware of the danger she was in. Daniel had no idea what was happening behind the scenes. To him, Eliza was still the passionate, naive woman who suspected nothing. But now, the game had changed. The silent hunt had begun, and this time, Daniel would not go unpunished. In the following days, Eliza maintained her routine as if nothing had changed. She knew she couldn't show any sign of alarm, because any hint of it could cause Daniel to retreat and vanish before justice could catch him. But inside, her heart pounded with the anxiety of someone walking on the edge of an abyss. She had to remain strong. It was not just about reclaiming her house or her assets. It was about preventing him from destroying more lives. Then, Daniel made his next move. During breakfast on an ordinary Saturday, he cast the bait Eliza had been expecting. "I think we should set the wedding date as soon as possible," he said with a calculated smile. "Maybe it's a good time to start fresh, without worries." Eliza, clutching her coffee cup tightly to steady her trembling hands, smiled back. "What do you suggest?" she asked, keeping her voice light, as if she were genuinely considering the idea. Daniel appeared pleased. "Next week we could travel, perhaps to Europe. Since you're so overwhelmed with work, it would be good to take a break from everything. Then we'll return and finalize the wedding details." Eliza felt a shiver run down her spine. He wanted to take her out of the country, away from her office, from her clients, from any resource that could stop his fraud. If she accepted, she knew everything would be lost. But Eliza was no longer an undefended prey. Instead of directly refusing, she planted a seed of doubt. "It sounds wonderful, but I need to sort a few things out at the office first. Maybe in a few weeks?" Daniel hesitated for a second, analyzing her response. She held her breath, waiting for his reaction. Then, to her relief, he smiled and held her hand. "Whatever is best for you, my love." But Eliza knew. He was weighing her words, trying to determine whether she was truly distracted or if she already suspected something. That night, lying next to him, Eliza stared at the ceiling, battling anguish. She felt that time was running out. Daniel was growing impatient, and men like him did not handle delays in their plans well. She needed to act before he made a definitive and perhaps irreversible decision. If there was ever a moment to deliver the final blow, that moment was coming. Eliza already knew that Daniel was an experienced fraudster, but the true scope of what she was about to uncover surpassed her worst fears. Until then, she had thought he operated alone, deceiving successful women and seizing their assets. However, Michael's investigations revealed something much bigger. Daniel was not just a con artist. He was part of an organized criminal network involved in money laundering schemes. The connection came through a name that repeatedly appeared in the financial records Michael tracked: Armen Kazarian. The name, unknown to Eliza, made Michael pale. "This guy isn't just any investor," he explained, adjusting his glasses as he showed the documents. "He has ties to international illegal operations. If Daniel is working with him, this is not just a real estate scam. We're talking about a much more dangerous scheme." The impact of the revelation left Eliza speechless. Her fiancé wasn't just trying to steal her house and money. He was a piece in a much larger criminal structure. This meant that if he discovered he was being investigated, he might resort to extreme measures to protect his interests. The danger was real and immediate. If before Eliza had feared losing her assets, now she feared for her own safety. It was at that moment that Eleanor made a crucial decision. "This goes beyond a civil case," she said firmly. "From now on, this case will be handled at the federal level." With her judicial connections, she managed to mobilize a task force to monitor Daniel and his associates' movements. Government agents began mapping out his transactions, communications, and meetings. With each new discovery, it became clear that he wasn't just a simple swindler. He was a vital link in something much bigger. Eliza felt the weight of the situation bearing down on her shoulders. She had been chosen by Daniel because he saw her as a vulnerable target. But now, she had the advantage. No matter that she was dealing with dangerous criminals, she knew she couldn't back down. Daniel and his accomplices had not only tried to destroy her, they had tried to erase her history, her identity. And now, she was determined to ensure that justice was done, no matter the cost. The more Eliza investigated, the clearer it became that Daniel wasn't acting alone. The scam against her was just one piece of a much more complex scheme, involving lawyers, real estate agents, and even financial sector employees. Every fraudulent document, every suspicious transaction, every forged signature pointed to a network of conspirators operating with surgical precision. It wasn't just a crime against her. It was a system built to exploit victims like her. The first key piece fell into place when Michael discovered that the agent trying to sell her childhood home, Vanessa Reynolds, was married to Timothy Reynolds, a paralegal working for one of the city's most prestigious law firms. He was the one who had processed the forged documents for the transfer of ownership. But Timothy wasn't just an executor of the scam. He was part of a group that helped criminals manipulate property records without raising suspicions. Eleanor used her influence to put Timothy's firm under investigation. What they found was even worse than expected. It wasn't an isolated case. Several women with profiles similar to Eliza's had lost properties under suspicious circumstances. Daniel's scheme was much more structured than anyone had imagined. He didn't just seduce financially independent women. He had a team of specialists who made the perfect theft possible. Meanwhile, Daniel continued to act as if nothing were happening. Romantic dinners, passionate messages, wedding plans. To him, Eliza was still just another piece in the game. But now, she saw everything with clarity. The affection was calculated, the gestures were strategies, and the words were rehearsed lies. He had no idea that behind the scenes, every move he made was being monitored and recorded as evidence. The tension increased day by day. Eliza knew that as soon as Daniel realized he was cornered, he might try to flee, or worse, act unpredictably. But she was no longer alone. Now she had the law on her side, federal agents involved, and a plan to dismantle the entire network. The question was no longer if Daniel would be caught. It was when and how he would fall. Eliza no longer had any doubts. Daniel was surrounded, and every move he made was being monitored. But one essential detail was still missing before she could act. She needed to find out what his next steps were and ensure that he had no escape route. The plan was underway, but one mistake could ruin everything. Now, every detail mattered. Michael managed to access Daniel's recent communication records and found something alarming. In recent days, he had intensified his calls to contacts abroad. In particular, one name appeared several times: Arman Kazarian, the money laundering suspect, who was already on the authorities' radar. The messages exchanged between them indicated that Daniel was planning to move a large sum of money soon. The only doubt was, where would that amount come from? The answer came faster than they expected. Daniel had his eyes on two major real estate deals that Eliza had casually mentioned during breakfast: the Henderson estate and the Westbrook mansion, $2 million properties that were about to be sold, and for which she was legally responsible. If he managed to gain access to the transactions, he could divert millions without anyone noticing until it was too late. Now, Eliza understood why he wanted her to travel. He needed her to be away when everything happened. This time, she decided to reverse the game. She pretended to become increasingly involved with the wedding preparations, talked about honeymoon destinations, and even suggested accepting the trip he so desired. Meanwhile, Eleanor worked discreetly to block any suspicious financial movements and alert the companies involved in the negotiations. On the surface, nothing had changed. But behind the scenes, barriers were being erected to prevent Daniel from fleeing with the money. That night, while they dined together by candlelight, Eliza felt Daniel's gaze upon her. He believed he was in control. He thought that, in just a few days, he would have everything he wanted. Little did he know that at dawn, his house of cards would begin to crumble. The final blow was about to be delivered, and this time, he would be the one who wouldn't see the reversal coming. Eliza perfected her act. Every morning she woke up next to Daniel and allowed herself to smile as if she were excited about the new phase of their lives. She discussed wedding details, showed interest in the trip, and even joked about how many dresses she should take. But inside, her mind was elsewhere. She knew that every second was crucial. The noose was tightening, but Daniel still hadn't realized it. Behind the scenes, Eleanor and the federal agents advanced with the investigation. The Henderson estate and the Westbrook mansion, Daniel's targets, were now under surveillance, and any attempt to access them would be tracked. In addition, Michael managed to infiltrate a spyware program into Daniel's secondary computer, the one he believed to be secure. In a matter of minutes, they gained access to detailed spreadsheets with financial movements, forged contracts, and records of offshore accounts. What they saw confirmed everything. Daniel wasn't just a property thief. He was operating a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme, diverting assets from successful women to shell companies. But what caught the most attention was a recurring name in the files: Julian Hargrove, a real estate developer known for demolishing historic homes to build luxury developments. He was the hidden buyer of Eliza's house. Daniel not only wanted to sell it, he wanted to destroy it to erase any link to her history. The anger burned inside her, but Eliza maintained her facade. That night, when Daniel suggested a toast to celebrate the incredible life they would have together, she raised her glass and smiled. She pretended to be completely surrendered to the illusion he had created. And it was then, looking into the eyes of the man who planned to erase her, that she made her final decision. She didn't just want him to be arrested. She wanted him to know, at that exact moment, that he had lost. She wanted him to feel the same despair that so many women had felt when deceived by him. The next day, as Daniel left for a business meeting, Eliza sent a single message to Eleanor. It's time. The plan had been mapped out in every detail. While Daniel believed everything was proceeding as expected, Eliza and her team ensured that every piece was in place. Federal agents were already monitoring his every step. His contacts were under surveillance, and his bank accounts were about to be frozen. But no one predicted what happened that afternoon. Daniel began to grow suspicious. Michael noticed the first change while monitoring Daniel's communications. Suddenly, he stopped using his traditional means of contact and started calling unknown numbers, never staying on the line for more than a few seconds. Moreover, he accessed his bank account from an unregistered device, as if checking whether anything had been altered. He felt the noose closing in, and that made him unpredictable. The confirmation came a few hours later. One of Eleanor's informants, who worked at the records office, reported that Daniel had attempted to advance the transfer of Eliza's house to Julian Hargrove's name. Something that, until then, had been scheduled to occur in a few days, had now become urgent. He knew time was running out. If he could speed up the procedures and liquidate the assets before the authorities intervened, he might still escape with millions. Eliza realized at that moment that she needed to act ahead of schedule. She called Eleanor, who quickly reorganized the operation. Daniel's arrest warrant was ready, but it needed to be executed at the precise moment so that he wouldn't get away. The trap was set, and he was walking right into it without realizing it. That night, Eliza returned home and found Daniel more agitated than ever. He tried to maintain his composure, but his eyes were different, less confident, more calculating. She realized that deep down he already felt that something was wrong, but he still couldn't understand what. "I think we should go to Europe before the wedding," he suggested, feigning nonchalance. "We can settle everything over there more calmly." Eliza held her wine glass and smiled. "Sounds like a great idea," she lied. But deep inside, she knew he wasn't going anywhere. The next day, he would be arrested. That morning, Daniel woke up believing he was in control. He showered, dressed in his impeccable suit, and went about his routine as if nothing were happening. To him, everything was about to be resolved. The paperwork for Eliza's house was being finalized, and his international transactions were in the final stages. In a few hours, he would be free, with millions in his account and no trace of fraud. But what Daniel didn't know was that, at the moment he walked through the door of the apartment for yet another day of work, federal agents were already strategically positioned. As he drove to meet Julian Hargrove and finalize the last details of the fraudulent sale, Eliza received a discreet message from Michael. He's on his way. Everything is set. She read the message, took a deep breath, and looked at the engagement ring on her finger, the symbol of the lie she had lived for so many years. With a cold gesture, she took the ring off and placed it on the table. The arrest was swift and precise. Daniel entered the building where the meeting with Hargrove was to take place, unaware that he was surrounded. As soon as he stepped into the room, agents burst in, weapons drawn. "Daniel Mercer, you are under arrest for fraud, money laundering, and document forgery," announced one of the agents as he cuffed Daniel's wrists. For the first time, the man who always wore a confident smile lost all his composure. His world was crumbling before his eyes. Meanwhile, Eliza watched everything from a safe distance, alongside Eleanor and Michael. She observed through the surveillance cameras as Daniel was escorted out of the building, his hands cuffed, his face pale, and his gaze lost. She had waited years for that moment. The man who had tried to destroy her was now facing the consequences of his actions. But something was still missing. Minutes later, Daniel was placed in a police car. Before the door closed, an officer handed him an envelope. Inside was a single sheet, a copy of the original deed of Eliza's house, signed by the true owner, herself. At the bottom, a handwritten phrase read, "You lost." And for the first time, Daniel knew what it was like to be on the other side of the scam. At the moment Daniel was taken to the federal station, the illusion he had built over the years unraveled. He, who had always been in control, was now just another handcuffed criminal, powerless, penniless, and with no way out. His mind raced, trying to find an error, a loophole, something that could reverse the situation. But the truth was that he had been defeated at his own game, and that was destroying him from within. Eliza, accompanied by Eleanor and Michael, watched everything from afar. There was no need to confront him directly. Everything that needed to be said had already been communicated through the evidence, the arrest warrant, and the envelope he received at the moment of his capture. Daniel had spent his life taking advantage of others' trust, but now he was experiencing what it felt like to be deceived. For the first time, he didn't see the trap coming. In the interrogation room, the federal agents had no difficulty dismantling Daniel's version of events. The man who had always been articulate and calculating now appeared hesitant, unable to justify the overwhelming evidence against him. His bank accounts had been frozen, his accomplices began to be arrested, and the forged records he had so desperately tried to hide were now in the hands of justice. With no way out, Daniel tried to resort to his last strategy, emotional manipulation. "I loved her," he said, staring into the interrogation room camera, as if speaking directly to Eliza. "Everything I did was for us." But those words meant nothing anymore. Eleanor watched the scene without any emotion, while Eliza felt only indifference. He loved no one but himself. Every gesture, every word, every plan had always been coldly calculated for his own benefit. But now, none of that mattered. The mask had fallen. There was no more charm, no more allure, no more power. Daniel was alone, and the only thing left for him was to face the consequences of his actions. His empire of lies had crumbled, and he was about to pay the price for everything he had done. The days following Daniel's arrest were a whirlwind of events. The investigations advanced rapidly, and the federal prosecutors built a solid case against him and his accomplices. Julian Hargrove, the developer who had planned to demolish Eliza's house, was detained while attempting to board a private jet out of the country. Vanessa and Timothy Reynolds, responsible for the fraudulent paperwork, were arrested for facilitating document forgery and real estate fraud. The criminal network was collapsing. Eliza watched it all with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. She had spent months sleeping beside a man who was secretly planning to destroy her. Now, he was the one watching his life crumble before his eyes. But despite the victory, there was no satisfaction in revenge. What she felt was something deeper, a sense of justice, that no one else would suffer the same fate as Rebecca Chambers, Ellen Whitaker, and so many other women. Daniel's trial was set quickly, as the evidence was indisputable. Facing the threat of more than 30 years in prison, he tried to negotiate for a reduced sentence, offering information about his international contacts and Arman Kazarian. But the prosecutors were in no hurry. Kazarian's name was already on the authorities' radar, and every detail provided by Daniel only strengthened the case against the criminal organization. On the day Daniel was sentenced, Eliza did not attend the courtroom. She didn't need to see him again to know that he would finally face the consequences of his actions. Instead, she spent the day in the house he had tried to steal. She walked through the restored rooms, touched the walls that carried her family's history, and felt a wave of gratitude for having managed to protect it. That place was not just a property. It was part of her identity, and no one would ever tear that away from her. At night, sitting on the porch, watching the city lights in the distance, Eliza took a deep breath and allowed the tension of the past months to dissipate. Daniel was where he deserved to be. Justice had been done, and her story would not end like so many others before her. Now, finally, she was free. After months of tension, legal battles, and devastating revelations, Eliza found herself facing something she hadn't expected: silence. For the first time in a long time, her life was no longer in danger. There were no secrets hidden around every corner, and she no longer had to pretend to be someone she wasn't. Daniel was in jail, his criminal network had been dismantled, and her house, the very one she had almost lost, remained standing, untouched. But now, the question that always follows a great storm emerged: what to do with the newfound freedom? Returning to work seemed the most natural path. As a lawyer specializing in high-value properties, Eliza had always found joy in protecting historic legacies and ensuring that inheritances were not squandered by opportunists. But something within her had changed. Her own experience had opened her eyes to a much larger problem. How many other people had been victims of similar frauds? How many successful women had their lives destroyed by predators like Daniel? Driven by this unease, Eliza decided to redirect her career. With Eleanor's support, she launched a project aimed at victims of financial and real estate fraud, offering legal support to those who had been deceived and didn't know where to turn. Her story began to serve as an example, not of fragility, but of resilience. She knew what it was like to lose trust, to feel betrayed, to have one's identity threatened, and now she wanted to prevent that from happening to others. However, the restart wasn't limited to work. For the first time, Eliza allowed herself to look at her personal life without the shadow of Daniel looming over it. The sleepless nights, the moments of paranoia, the constant feeling of being watched, all of it began to fade away slowly. There were still scars, of course, but now they were marks of a war she had won. And above all, they were proof that she was far stronger than she had ever imagined. One afternoon, while walking through the streets of San Francisco, she felt the cold wind on her face and closed her eyes for a moment. There, amidst the city's noise and the soft warmth of the sun, she realized that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Her past had tried to define her, but she chose something different. She chose to move forward. She chose to start over. Time passed, and Eliza finally felt that her life was returning to normal. Her work helping fraud victims grew, and with each case resolved, she felt that her painful experience had not been in vain. Gradually, the memory of Daniel became a distant echo, a dark chapter that now belonged to the past. But fate, as always, had its own plans. On an ordinary morning, while reviewing documents in her office, her phone rang. It was Michael. The urgency in his voice made her heart race. "You need to see this," he said, sending a file to her email. With trembling hands, Eliza opened the attachment and felt the air leave her lungs. It was a record of a recent transaction, a funds transfer to an offshore account linked to Arman Kazarian. The sender, an unknown intermediary who, according to financial analysts, might be operating on Daniel's behalf. That made no sense. Daniel was in jail, facing a sentence long enough to make any financial movement impossible. How could he still be involved in illegal schemes? Could it be that he had accomplices on the outside, continuing his work? Or worse, that he was negotiating his own release? Eleanor was immediately alerted. Using her access to the judicial system, she confirmed that Daniel was still in custody, with no authorization for release. But the new movement suggested that someone, somewhere, was still acting on his behalf. "It's not over," said Eleanor, closing the folder of documents on the table. Someone is trying to ensure he gets back in the game. A chill ran down Eliza's spine. She had believed that chapter of her life was closed, but now she realized that maybe the story hadn't ended yet. Suddenly, the freedom she had fought so hard for seemed threatened once again. But if there was one thing Daniel didn't know, it was that this time, she wouldn't be caught off guard. Eliza knew she couldn't ignore that sign. If Daniel still had influence outside of prison, it meant that his network hadn't been completely dismantled. And worse, it meant that he still believed he could escape. Her instinct told her that this was not just a financial movement. It was a warning, a final move from a man who refused to accept his defeat. Michael intensified the investigation and discovered that the account to which the money had been sent belonged to a lawyer specializing in international settlement negotiations. This could indicate two things. Either Daniel was buying protection from within the prison, or he was trying to negotiate a possible extradition to a country with no extradition treaty with the United States. Either way, he still had allies working for him. Eleanor, now fully involved in the case, acted swiftly. With her influence in the judicial system, she gained access to monitored conversations of Daniel in prison. What they discovered confirmed their suspicions. He had been in contact with someone on the outside, someone who was still free and willing to help him. The intercepted conversation revealed a name that Eliza never expected to hear again: Julian Hargrove. Hargrove, the businessman who had nearly demolished her house, had managed to escape the most serious charges during his initial trial and was back in the game, still operating behind the scenes. Now it seemed that he and Daniel were reactivating their criminal partnership. If they managed to complete their plan, Daniel could vanish off the map even before he was brought to trial. Time was against them. But Eliza was no longer the woman who once trusted Daniel blindly. This time she would take the initiative. With a strategic plan devised together with Eleanor and Michael, they formulated a counterattack to expose Julian Hargrove before any ransom could be arranged. If Daniel thought he still had a chance to escape, he was about to discover that his last move would also be his checkmate. The noose around Daniel was closing for the second time, but this time Eliza felt something different, a dark premonition that something was not right. Everything had been meticulously planned. The authorities were ready to intercept any attempt at escape. Julian Hargrove was under surveillance, and the suspicious accounts had been traced. Nothing seemed to be slipping through the cracks, and yet something still unsettled her. The night before the final execution of the plan, Eliza had a strange dream. She was in her grandmother's house, the very one she had nearly lost to Daniel, but the furniture was covered with white sheets, as if the house were abandoned. She walked through the rooms until she reached the library, where a vague figure was sitting in her grandmother's favorite chair. "He cannot escape what he has done," said a voice, firm and emotionless. When Eliza tried to approach, she woke up breathless, her heart racing. The next day, as they prepared for the operation, Michael received a phone call from the prison. Something unexpected had happened. Daniel Mercer was dead, found lifeless in his cell, with no clear signs of violence, no farewell note, no apparent explanation. The man who had deceived so many people, who had spent years orchestrating scams, simply disappeared, even before being tried. The news hit like a thunderbolt. How was that possible? No evidence indicated that he had been murdered, and even the medical examiners were uncertain about the exact cause of death. A sudden heart attack? An undetectable poisoning? Or simply the weight of a criminal mind that couldn't bear its own end? Nothing made sense. And the most disturbing part, the transactions linked to him stopped instantly, as if someone, somewhere, already knew that he would no longer need that money. That night, Eliza stood in front of her house, looking at the lit windows, feeling that, somehow, it was all beyond her comprehension. Daniel had been punished, but not in the way she expected. To this day, no one has been able to explain exactly what happened. But somehow, Eliza knew that justice had been served, in a way that not even the law could have foreseen. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs this message of overcoming injustice. Subscribe for more inspiring stories of courage and determination. Join our community to be moved by real accounts of strength and transformation.